Jakob Rasmussen on Living Labs Global juhataja.
Cool, fine. So, wow, can you hear me? I can hear myself. Hello, hi, so my name is Jakob Rasmussen. I come from a non-profit organization which is called Living Labs Global. And basically, our role is not the innovation part of the smart cities value chain, but actually the diffusion part. How do we take the inventions, the services, the products that we develop and actually scale them up on the global level? So I will tell you a little about today how we do that. I will give you a concrete example from one of the communities we're currently building, and I will show you some of the cases we've done around the world, some of the solutions that we've kind of linked up with cities worldwide. So you can kind of say, if you have, a lot of what I've seen here today is about how do we create new solutions, how do we become more efficient and so on. Of course, what we are interested in is then when you actually harvest these successes in the smart cities, when you find out new ways of constructing buildings or better ways of using raw material or smarter services for healthcare that actually creates economic value and societal value, how do we then ensure that as many cities as possible around the world can actually utilize those same results? That's what we want to see. And the idea, of course, is that we kind of see innovation as a way to boost economic efficiency, economic effectiveness, creating new strategic opportunities, and ultimately impacting the global economy positively by reducing cost, by improving quality of care, quality of public services, and so on. So we kind of want to see that actually society can harvest those results on a global level. And that's not an easy process, I can tell you. Okay, we're running a few web pages. You can go to them. Open Challenge is not up yet. It will be up in a couple of months. You might know citymart.com that we've been running for many years. So basically this is has been historically our main line of activity, actually connecting solutions in across all industries with cities worldwide. And currently we are building what is called FI Star Community, which is a global community of healthcare solutions. So we're starting to target verticals. And I'll go through the FI Star process today so you have an idea about what we do and if you want to, how you can connect. And then I'll give you some examples from Citymart, with some of the big cities in the world like San Francisco and so on that we've worked with and how that works in real life, you can say. So I'll just skip through the megatrends because I think we've heard about them enough and show you some of the research that we did that were the reason that we're doing this today. So basically, a couple of years ago, we looked at how big is actually global procurement and why do we constantly hear about cases where this is not going well or it's difficult, or how do we actually address this? And of course, when we look at the total market globally for public procurement, it's massive. Right? We're talking about $5 trillion being spent on external services from cities around the world. So what we did was that we did a survey of 500 cities to understand what are the issues, what are the challenges they're faced with, trying to utilize this massive demand into actually getting innovation into society to make society a better place to be and a more economically sustainable place to be. So first of all, some of the things we found out was that 90% of public organizations actually don't publish their needs. They don't go out and say, look, we need services and better services in healthcare. We need a cheaper way of constructing houses. We need more energy efficient buildings. Of course, when we are at conferences like this, we have the presentations and so on available. But when private companies actually knock on the door in cities and say, look, I have a new technology that might help you, they don't know, is this something that the city actually likes? So just here we had an idea that there was a disconnect between demand. The demand might be there, but nobody knows it's there from the outside. So bridging this interface between the great solutions and the needs could actually be quite difficult because no one has the information. I've been sitting with representatives of cities from around the world on one side and providers on the other side and talking about how do we create this interface, right? And the companies don't know what the cities want, and the cities might not feel confident about publicly stating, look, this is our list of priorities. Also, the next challenge is that actually very few public organizations have a systematic process of screening innovations and saying, look, what's available out there? What are the 100 smartest ways of treating water? What are the kind of the 100 smartest ways of making sustainable buildings? So systematically screening not only existing but also up and coming technologies, and having a way for kind of integrating that into the whole process that goes before procurement, kind of looking at strategically where should we go, is not necessarily systematically implemented. So this is all based on original research, on actually asking cities, right? And then also another challenge is that you see on a global level that actually, few public organizations systematically consider solutions from outside of their own region. So there's a lot of emphasis on how do we invent new solutions, how do we kind of, use R&D funding to create interesting companies or interesting projects. But of course, there are very few cities in the world that have the size and capacity to become leader in more than a few fields. So of course, ultimately, what you want to do is that you want to say you're specializing. There was a very interesting point in one of the earlier presentations with all these, hundreds of projects that cities were running. And we actually see this as a pattern across the world, that cities might be doing too much with the funding they have. So they spread it out thinly, and they keep reinventing the same solutions over and over again instead of specializing. And this, of course, means that there's a massive opportunity cost. They don't harvest the value they could of these innovations. And that's kind of what we're trying to see we can find a way around to use public money better. But of course, there are also some legal aspects here, right? That public organizations, to an extent, is not really allowed to have in-depth discussions with private providers if they subsequently want to buy from them, because they might give them preferential treatment and so on. So there's actually a need for some kind of other interface where you can get this information without actually coming into conflict with the procurement frameworks and the laws that you have to apply to. Now, the challenge, of course, is seen in when actually you look at the cost of these solutions and you look at the time it takes to implement them and the average success, that if you kind of reinvent the same solutions, if you don't have this vivid exchange of knowledge, what happens is that solutions become much more expensive to implement. They take a longer time, because it's not kind of an off-the-shelf product. You need to learn along the way. And also the chances of them succeeding are often lower, because what happens is that many companies will do this for the first time. So imagine if you bought your PC and you couldn't kind of buy it from the best global provider, but you had to ask a local company every time you wanted a new PC to reinvent it and build it from scratch. And you kind of see this is sort of the same challenge we often have with these kind of smart services, that we're inventing them from scratch instead of actually looking where should we specialize and where should we buy what has already been tested and where all the kind of bugs and errors and challenges have been taken out of the process. And we've seen from many of the services that we've helped cities kind of identify and buy, that we are taking procurement processes that normally took 3 years down to 6 months, for example. We're actually reducing the cost by more than a factor 20, because now you're buying existing technology that you already know work. And you also know what kind of impact you can expect. So the whole value proposition from the city becomes much more interesting, where you are not just replicating, but you're actually buying from other places. But of course, we see, we have this kind of global event annually where we bring out all the cities that we work with together. And of course, we see constantly that, there's a massive interest in actually sharing these experiences. But there is, for many of the cities we work with, and even big cities like San Francisco and London, not really a place where they say, look, where can we actually kind of exchange the real knowledge about what works and what doesn't work? And that is some of the challenges that we're trying to address. There are many companies providing solutions here. We counted over 3 million. Of course, there are kind of new startups and there are companies that fail and so on and so forth. So there's a massive opportunity, but we also see that very few of these companies are actually able then to sell their solutions. And I have an example, which is actually here from Estonia, which is one of the cases where we kind of opened our eyes. This is from Now Innovations, one of the first companies to create mobile parking and make that available on a societal level. And we actually looked at their business case. So this is kind of timeline of 10 years, and we looked at how many meetings they had with cities trying to sell their solution, right? This was a kind of killer app, right? I mean, you can reduce, you can make it much easier for people to find a parking place. You can reduce CO2 emissions, you can make revenue for the city. I mean, it has everything. It's a fantastic, smart solution. But actually, they had to visit around a little over 1,000 cities in order to identify who was actually interested in buying their solution. And from the cities that were interested, they could only sell about 11 contracts on this. So that was extremely costly for a small company to spend, 7.5 million euros actually trying out selling their product. Now, but one of the main challenges they found out was that many of the cities they visited just copied their solution, say, oh, it's a fantastic solution. We'll ask the local company to implement it, right? So of course, in that sense, it become very difficult for a company like that has a leading solution to scale it up if everyone else is kind of copying it. And they at the same time have to take the full marketing cost. So we kind of saw a big gap in how do we actually make this market work. And I'll show you the case from the FI Start community we're building up. So basically what we try to do is that we actually bring the demand side and the supply side together. So we sit down with the demand side, in this case healthcare providers, so we're talking about municipalities, hospitals, it can be regional, national, municipal governments depending on the healthcare system, private providers, insurance companies, pharmacists and so on. And then we found out what are your actual needs, what are the needs, what are the challenges you're looking at. And then we make them visible. So we do this while conducting workshops, we do interviews. There's also the possibility to just kind of put the challenges up yourself. And then we basically speak with as many municipalities, local governments, other entities that are kind of controlling public procurement or influencing this to identify exactly what is the challenges that you have in particular. And this is kind of a two-way process, because what we also do is that we say which solutions are available out there. So when I see fantastic solutions, from Finland and from other places, I'm all ears, because I understand that there might be a need out there which is currently not catered for. So any solutions or any company that kind of has something they can prove and say, look, we've implemented this, it works, it's fantastic. I know there's a need somewhere else in the world from a city saying that's exactly what we need to make our city run better and to make our local economy more viable. Then we have a nice website, which is, I'm not sure how nice it is, but this is our website, where we basically outline, so what are the challenges that are currently, where's there a demand? And then we look at the solutions out here. So we can also inspire and say, look, did you know that there is a solution out here for urban transportation, for example, where you actually combine the advantages of buses and taxis? And there might be cities out there saying, that's exactly what we need to solve our transportation problems. And it's the most fascinating challenges we get. But the idea, of course, is also that, I think it was mentioned yesterday, that these are kind of micro markets, right? So actually you realize that, one small part of the whole public service provisioning, once you scale that across 1,000 cities, it's a big market. And that's where we think it becomes really interesting on making these connections. So a challenge in this case, this is healthcare. I'm going to show you some other challenges that were kind of from other areas of city technologies. So challenges is a real need. And some of these challenges are like, how can we reduce waiting time to the doctors, right? And you're like, hey, that's a problem we all kind of recognize, right? Or how can you make, online appointment with your doctor? In many cities actually across the world, you don't have that opportunity. And of course, it's a societal cost, because if I, need to spend longer time than the doctor than I need to, I can't work. So there's a productivity issue and so on and so forth. So many of these challenges you can solve, and some of them are so small, but when you scale them up, they become massive. Or how do we better utilize public data? I mean, big cities, even like London, for example, have been criticized for, you make all this data available, but the interfaces are horrible. So if they could actually share, solutions that would develop elsewhere to utilize that, that would be a massive gain for the economy. So basically, we sit down, or any partner organization, we have a methodology that we can share. We sit down and actually try and identify what are the needs, and then we publish them. And we currently have around 100 needs in the pipeline. I can show you some of them. But I can just show you some examples. For example, how do you actually, kind of early diagnosis or prevention of cardiovascular challenges, right? And there can be challenges so that how do we create, early warning systems, or there can be challenges so that how do we actually monitor these conditions if you're not located close to a hospital. And there are solutions out there. There are companies that are actually creating online real-time monitoring systems, or that are kind of creating rehabilitation solutions. And of course, if you don't have that in your society, but you discover that they are available, you suddenly realize there's a huge potential in actually improving the provision of healthcare services in society. A second challenge, which is well known to many hospitals, is kind of hospital-acquired infections, right? I mean, in Denmark, where I come from, we have people dying from this every year, really nasty infections. And actually, there was a public report in Denmark, which kind of claims to be one of the advanced countries in the world, saying we can't combat it. But surprise, surprise, of course, there's solutions out there. Anything from improving hygiene standards to robots that can kind of do UV radiation and so on. So by connecting this, we can actually solve problems that were considered to be unsolvable. Now, very simple. What we do with these challenges is that we publish them. We then go out and then we identify all the interesting companies that are out there and connect them with the cities. And what happens from there on is the responsibility of the public organizations. That's not our business. We just connect. And of course, the next step is then to find out, look, is there something here that we want to pursue with? Do we see a business case here? Do we want to do a pilot? Do we want to take this into procurement? Where do we want to take this? But kind of creating this radar is actually what makes this happen, this market happen. I will give you a solution. This was one of the solutions that inspired us. This is from Stockholm, and it's a solution for the blind, micronavigation. The interesting thing here was that there were similar solutions around the world that were much more primitive. But what we tried to do here was that we looked at kind of, giving the visually impaired citizens in our country the ability to fully navigate a city, right? This is a solution where you kind of combine GPS and mobile, triangulation of your position, so you can very precisely say, look, take 2 steps, forward and 1 step to the right, and then you will be at your destination. What we looked at was actually what is the economic value for society, right? So when we kind of go beyond the idea of we have a problem, let's solve it, and suddenly look at what is the socio-economic impact of this, that's when I fell off my chair, right? Looking at, in this case, this is much more than just solving a problem for the visually impaired citizen. Because once they become more self-sufficient, they can take other jobs. They are more self-reliant. They need less public services. You need to put less infrastructure into the city to support them. And when you start adding up these numbers, we suddenly saw that actually a system that cost something like 350,000 euros gave annual benefits of 7 million euros to the city of Stockholm. And that's a lot of money. And then when we start scaling that up on the global level, we saw that other cities with a much larger population of visually impaired citizens, the savings were enormous and the economic productivity gains were enormous. So actually many of the solutions we're discussing here today go way beyond solving a specific problem. I mean, there's so much money available to society in efficiency gains, gains in effectiveness, and new strategic opportunities that we can solve a lot of our financial problems just by utilizing this technology that's already out there. And so we, of course, see this as one of, part of our social mission to say, look, if we can get that innovation into society and harvest this kind of economic gains, we can solve a lot of problems. And we can reallocate a lot of budget to other more worthy causes in society. So some of the examples of solutions we've helped put into society. This is an example from San Francisco. San Francisco, one of the most advanced areas in the world, and still they fail to kind of say, how can we find a flexible lighting system? We're close to Silicon Valley, but they tried 3 times to kind of find a lighting system that could satisfy their conditions. And we found out that one of the main challenges was actually that it was not just about lighting system. It was because you had all these kind of different departments in the city of San Francisco that needed sensors and stuff and so on top of these kind of light poles. Everything from national security to pollution monitoring to traffic monitoring and so on. So we had to go all the way to a country from Switzerland. So normally what we do is that kind of you have a challenge like this, you find perhaps 20, 40, perhaps 100 companies that can actually solve that have a solution. And then the city themselves kind of go through and say, look, we're interested in speaking to this company. So in Switzerland, they found exactly the solution they needed with a kind of, it was actually not a company that even kind of produced, street lighting. It was a company that did kind of sensor integration. And suddenly you have a connection from San Francisco to Switzerland and a company being able to sell their technology out of there. They probably would never have been in the US if it wasn't for that type of call. We also have some cities that say, look, we want to go directly beyond this piloting phase. Barcelona, for example, had said, look, we just want to procure directly solutions. And instead of rolling them out on a large scale from the beginning, they start in small city districts. Put them in there, traffic censoring, kind of monitoring garbage collection, so you can do on-demand garbage collection. All these kind of amazing things that they do on a small scale. Then they look at whether they actually have the economic impact that they want, and then they can subsequently go up to full-scale implementation in the city. Yeah, that was it.